Well, Nolan, as you know, and as I'm sure everybody that pays attention to this YouTube channel and things know, that I am a big fan of conversation. And I think that as tensions in our country and even in the church, and I think for me, that's my biggest concern is the tensions that are prevalent in the church. I think as those tensions rise, it makes having conversations even more necessary. Unfortunately, we're all separated from each other right now, so it makes conversations even more difficult. And maybe that's one reason why the tensions are so high, is because we haven't been able to be with each other as much. But it makes it so important, I think, that we have conversations and that we listen to each other. And man, you're one of my favorite people in the world. And every time these kinds of things happen in our country and in our community, man, I'm always thinking about you and your safety and your family and everything that you guys are going through. So if you don't mind, just kind of introduce yourself for the audience and let everybody know who you are and what you do.
Cool. I'm Nolan Murray, and I've been a law enforcement for 7 years now. I was working in Missouri for 5 years, where I was part of a SWAT team for 4 years, and as well as a narcotics task force, where we worked with the federal entities quite a bit. And I'd say we averaged close to probably about 140 search warrants a year. Then we moved to Texas for better quality of life and better environment. And here I've been working for 2 years, and recently I became a field training officer, as well as a new program that we got up and going at our agency with drones. So hopefully, when and if I can get through the training, I'll be a drone pilot.
Oh, wow.
So,
That's news to
yeah.
me. I didn't know that. That's great.
Yeah, it all happened within I guess this past week.
Oh,
So
wow. Fantastic.
it's pretty exciting. It's a lot more in depth than I actually thought it would be. And so, because you have to get your FAA license, and so you have to learn how to talk to like the airport terminals, the control towers, and stuff like that. So it's pretty hard.
Wow. Wow.
But yeah, it's very interesting. It's a whole new world for me. So we'll see how it goes.
Well, wow. Interesting. And man, just thank you for the work that you do. I thought it'd be good to start with sort of a positive question. So why
Sure.
don't you tell people what are some of your favorite things about your job? Why do you like being in law enforcement? Why do you do what you do?
Well, there's so many answers to that question. I mean, I do love my job. Law enforcement has been nothing but amazing. One of the reasons I got into law enforcement was because the thought of sitting behind a desk or knowing and doing the exact same thing every day, I couldn't do it. I'm not made that way. So law enforcement's great for me because, I don't know, when I go into work, I don't know what I'm going to be doing that day, whether it's going to be it's going to be a slow night or it's going to be busy, whether I'll just, the highlight of my day is going to be changing a tire, or, whether it's going to be something fun and exciting. It's so different every day. But I also, I wanted to do something that I thought was honorable, something that I could be proud of, something bigger than myself, as well as something that my kids and my family could be proud of. So all those things kind of wrapped together. I was medically discharged from the military after only a couple of years. And so I was like, well, what's similar to it? And so signed up to be in law enforcement, and here I am today.
Awesome. Awesome. So I'm sure this question could be answered 1,000 different ways, but what is at least one thing, and feel free to give us more than that. What do you wish that the average person knew about law enforcement?
That is a difficult question. There's so much misinformation out there about like what law enforcement officers do, But I guess to answer your question, maybe I think. Okay, well, let me start off by saying that all of my experiences are exactly that. They're my personal experiences. Law enforcement officers across the world obviously have different experiences, and so and so they haven't experienced what I've done, what I felt, or what I've experienced. And so let me just start off by saying that. But what I would want the general public to know would be what, and I got to preface it once again with saying I actually don't want this for anybody, but I would want them to know what it feels like to be in a fist fight or a fight for your life, to have your bones broken, to have somebody running at you with a knife, trying to kill you, have somebody shooting at you. I would want them to know what it's like to be shot. I would want them to know the anger that is felt when you go on scene and you see some kids killed by their own parents. I don't want that for anybody, but all of those things create your the way that you see not only the world, but specifically use of force, right? Which use of force, I think, is the biggest dividing factor from police and citizens. And so if I would want them to know anything, it would be, like I said, those situations that completely change your life.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about race, and I would love just to hear your perspective on race and racism, and maybe even outside of law enforcement, but just what's your perspective? And that's the conversation that's going on now, and one that I think is incredibly important. And we all, and like you said about your perspective in law enforcement, we all have a different perspective. We all have different experiences, and it shapes how we have those conversations and what we think about when we see something on television or we see something on social media. It's our personal experiences and perspectives shape our perspective and what we think on that. So I'd love to hear your perspective.
Well, I mean, I work with so many different people, Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, female, male, and they're all my brothers and sisters. I mean, I know they have my back, I have their back. And so, I mean, we don't really see each other that way. And as far as my 7 years in law enforcement goes, I've never seen a police officer, and once again, this is my personal experience, but I've never seen a police officer act or say or do something motivated by somebody else's race. When you get sent to a call, you don't really care who. I mean, I don't mean this to sound bad, but you don't care who they are. You don't care what their religion is. You don't care what they look like. You don't really care what their background is. You're there because somebody needed help or they had a problem they couldn't solve, and so you're there and you help them out with that. And race never has played a part in it for me or for any of my coworkers that I'm aware of. But I will say that what's interesting is in Missouri where we were, white supremacist gangs were very popular. There were probably 5 or 6 that I can think of off the top of my head. And what's involved with gangs is typically illegal activity, and so gangs tend to get targeted by police. And so we served a lot of warrants on gang members or clubhouses. We arrested many gang members, and it was always interesting seeing what they had in their personal belongings or what tattoos they had on them, because it would be oftentimes with those white supremacist gangs, you'd find KKK paraphernalia, you'd find that they had swastikas tattooed on their face or their arms, or the SS lightning bolts. You'd find a lot of Nazi Germany stuff. And so it was very eye-opening for me when I first started seeing all of that, because I didn't know that existed really anymore. I thought it was all in the history books. And so it was pretty eye-opening seeing all that stuff. And that became one of our favorite things to do, was to basically target those gangs, those white supremacist gangs, and arrest them for their illegal activity. And so really what's kind of interesting and ironic is what I have seen in my experience is that law enforcement has actually kind of combated racism in that way. And it was very different, you know. And then as I've went through my career, I've seen kind of the reverse too. So what I mean by that is I've showed up on scene with a black police officer. And if we, it's this one specific incident I'm thinking about, but we were dealing with a few black subjects who I don't remember what the situation was, a disturbance of some sort. But they wanted nothing to do with the black police officer because they were, I don't know, they were saying that he was, basically a traitor to the black community for being a police officer. And so I've seen stuff like that several times, and it's a shame that the black police officers are being targeted in that way, especially in this one circumstance was by another black or by several black people, and it's interesting talking to those officers afterwards who, it's like they feel completely outed by their own community in that sense. And so, that's really about the extent of the racism that I've personally dealt with. Megan, my wife, as a nurse, she does home health. And so she goes and sees different patients. She's done home health for close to 10 years now. But she, it's interesting. Some of her patients that she's had, they say some, not all, of course, but she's had some conversations where the patient was extremely racist. And as a father of a black daughter, that it's very eye-opening and concerning for me, knowing that there are people who actually think those things about other people based off of the color of their skin. And it's obviously scary for me because that could be somebody talking about my daughter in a few years or anything like that. And so I mean, racism is obviously very I don't want to say very prevalent. It is prevalent in our country though, and unfortunately I think that it's going to be one of those things that always does exist, just because we're made up. I mean, we're human, right? And sin is always going to be around as long as we're around. And so, unfortunately, I do think that's something that I don't think we're ever going to win the war on completely.
Yeah, it's a shame. And and I keep trying to think through that, because that's an interesting thought. And I agree. I think that that sin, because of the human brokenness, that is always going to be prevalent. And unfortunately, I think that a lot of times human efforts to try to solve human brokenness only compound the problem. And we see that not just in the United States, but we see that across the world, that when you try to solve ethnic tensions with worldly solutions, we end up perpetuating the problem generation after generation. And I think that the church has to be this alternative community where we're not going to be perfect for sure, and we're
Right.
still going to have to deal with the biases and the prejudices that are in our own hearts, and allow the Spirit to work on us. But we've got to be the ones to set the example, to show people this is what it looks like. This is what it looks like to love each other and to bear each other's burdens.
No, absolutely right. And what's interesting is I think the church has actually done a terrible job in the past of being the leaders in dealing with racism. When I went to school in Tennessee, there's a black congregation versus a white congregation. Like, why? That should not be a thing in the Lord's church. And unfortunately, it still is. And that I don't think was because of a explicitly racist type of thinking, but I think it's because of a lack of, I don't know, maybe it is a subconscious racism, and that, they don't want anything to do with us, or I don't know what the thinking is behind it, because I don't understand.
Yeah. And I think and I think it's interesting that we are so, you and I didn't grow up in the Jim Crow South, obviously, but
Right.
it's such a recent thing. You know, my parents grew up right at the end of segregation, right as schools were being integrated and those kind of things, and it's easy for us to, I guess, to look at these congregations across the South, and it's probably that way a little bit in the North in places, but they existed. Two separate congregations existed because when they were established, it was against city code for them to meet together. And the church, again, should have led the way in saying, nonsense. We're going to meet with our African American brothers and sisters because they're our family, and just because a
Yes.
city code says so, that's nothing to us. We're going to do what's right. But they
Yes.
didn't, and in fact, a lot of times
Uh-huh.
Christians were the ones that caused those types of situations to be the
Yes.
case. And so now, now you've got 50 or 60 years removed from that, but there's just a lot of tension that has continued to build up, and an apathy that says, you know what, it wasn't my fault, it wasn't my problem, and just a refusal to fix the situation that was caused by, again, by human brokenness and sin, and we have to
Mhm.
deal with that. And I think this goes back to what you were saying a minute ago, and just talking about law enforcement officers. I think that human beings have this tendency to overgeneralize, and we have this tendency to see a problem and then make blanket statements. I think
Yes.
that that's at the heart of racism, and has been. And whether it's white supremacy that says everybody that's like me is good and better, and everybody that's not like me is bad and less, or criminalizing people because of the color of their skin, or whatever the case may be, making those overgeneralizations. But it also
Mhm.
happens to law enforcement officers. And somebody
Yes.
sees a problem that might exist in a city, or a problem that might exist within a police department, or a problem that exists in an individual police officer, whatever the case may be, and then they make
Yeah.
these overgeneralizations, and they apply that to everybody that wears the badge. And I know, again, like I said in the beginning, I know when these types of incidents happen, I mean, my first thought is for my African American brothers and sisters, and then my second thought, or maybe vice versa, is for my brothers and sisters in uniform. And so, if you would just speak to how, like, our current situation with the unrest in our country, how has that made your job personally more difficult and more dangerous?
Uh, well, it obviously has. Um, and I think one of the things is, I think there's been, since the riots have started, since all of this came to a head, I think that there's been more than 700 officers injured, and that was as of June 8th, and that's due to the protests. Um, so 700 officers, and that could be anything from a cut. I don't know exactly the details of why or what that encompasses, Um, but there's been a lot of officers injured due to the protests. And I think one of the biggest things that hurts law enforcement is media. And that's because, I mean, we have to, when you're watching the news or you see on social media, anything like that, I mean, what typically do you see with law enforcement? It's usually somebody getting arrested, or fighting the police, or something like that, and that never looks good, even when it's completely justified. But that's what we're seeing of law enforcement, is people going to jail and people fighting. And so, whether it's conscious or subconscious, kind of like the church thing, that's how we start to see it, right? And so, when the public thinks of police officers, that's kind of maybe the thing that they think of them. Whether that's true or not, I think that's I mean, psychological warfare has been a thing for a reason, right? You start changing the way people think without them knowing it, and I think that's what's happening with it. There's been, so as of right now, this year alone, there's been 150 officers that have been shot. and 26 have been killed. So we have 26 officers who were killed. Last year in Afghanistan, from everything that I could tell, there were 22 soldiers who were killed. So we're having more police officers killed on U.S. soil than what we're having overseas in Afghanistan in a war zone. In 2018, there were, or 2019, there was 48 police officers and police women who were killed. And as opposed to that, 56 was the year before that. I mean, it's bad. I mean, when we have more police death more so than soldiers, and these are police deaths that are caused by felonious acts, whether it's being stabbed to death, shot, intentionally ran over with a car, things like that. It's not just they fell asleep while they were driving down the road, because the death rates are a lot higher if you include all of them. But people don't realize how dangerous it actually is to be in law enforcement. And obviously, those aren't situations we deal with every single day. What I find to be more difficult, because we deal with it more, is, well, I'll give you a story. Just the other day, a couple weeks ago, I guess, down the road, a neighbor's house, their fire alarm went off. And so up come all the fire trucks, and all the neighborhood kids got to go look, because they come out with their sirens and stuff. And there's this one little girl across the street from us. She's black. She's probably 3 or 4. And she comes and plays in our house all the time, plays with our kids all the time. We do a lot of stuff together. And her family knows that I'm a police officer. But this little girl sees these firemen roll up, and she thinks they're police. And she's like, "It's the police. Are they here to kill us?" And that just broke my heart. I mean, like, that's the information, that's the lesson that is being taught. Or maybe it's not intentionally being taught, but that's the lesson, that's what they're getting from all of this stuff that's going on, that police are here to kill people especially who are of color or a minority. Like, that's absolutely heartbreaking to me. And if it's happening in our neighborhood, then I know it's happening across America. And once again, it might be unintentional, but that's the lesson that they're here to learn. And I think Martin Luther King said, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation and not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And like you said before, we have to stop overgeneralizing groups, whether it's because of their skin color, their ethnic background, or their jobs. Like, we have to stop overgeneralizing. We need to start. There's bad police officers, yes. There's probably racist police officers, even though I haven't seen it. I'm sure it exists, because once again, we're human. But we can't judge any group or people because of 1 or 2 persons' actions. I mean, I was shot by a black male. My wife was robbed by a black male. But that doesn't mean that we think that all black people or any other person that looks different from us, that's not who they are. That's ludicrous, and it's also unscriptural to judge somebody based off of another's actions. And so, like you said, we have to stop that. That's one of the biggest things that I think would solve a lot of the headbutting and division that we have in our country today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it all comes down to, loving people, and even if we know someone is, our enemy, Jesus would say, love them anyway. But assuming someone is your enemy when they've done nothing to prove themselves to be your enemy, certainly you shouldn't treat them in an unloving way. And I'm afraid
Absolutely.
that the way that we talk about people and make overgeneralizations, certainly we're not being loving, and we're making all kinds of assumptions about them as if they're our enemy, and we're only perpetuating that cycle. We're making whatever bad things exist, we're only going to perpetuate it by making overgeneralizations and assumptions and treating people with disrespect.
Yes, absolutely.
So what would you say would be, because I feel like there's a lot of people, there's obviously a lot of extremism, there's a lot of polarization, there's people on the far right and the far left, for lack of better terms, on any conversation that we could possibly have. There's people on both extremes, but I feel like there's a whole lot of people, especially Christians, that want to find some sort of middle ground and want to find a way to be balanced and a way to be loving to everybody and encouraging to everybody. So what would you say to Christians that want to support the African American community, but more specifically their African American brothers and sisters, and support the law enforcement officers?
I think I don't know if I can answer that in one way.
Sure.
Mark, it was Matthew 10 when Jesus is, he's sending his apostles out into the world, and he says that we to act as wise as serpents and as innocent as doves. And I think that, especially initially, but not just Christians either, the world has stopped acting wisely. They stopped speaking wisely, and we have to be careful of that. I think that right there would help a lot too. If we start there, it's gonna make things a lot easier for us. And I think finding the common ground would be probably the first step, right? I think that when that video came out of George Floyd, I think everybody was outraged, especially law enforcement. And so that right there is our common ground. But as brothers and sisters in Christ, that's our common ground. That's where we should be unified. And it doesn't matter. It shouldn't matter. And I guess it might in some places, but the color of your skin, your job, it doesn't matter in the church. We're all brothers and sisters. And so finding the common ground, it's got to be the starting point. One of the things that I think would also help would be to something Megan, she followed it or heard it in one of her Facebook groups or something, but it stay in your lane. There was a conversation I heard the other day, and it was this lady. She's a professor. I don't remember, some very fancy, expensive university. She's a doctor of some sort. But anyways, she said, how are you going to fix the world when you don't understand the world? How would a mechanic fix a motor when he doesn't understand the basic functioning of a combustible motor? We can't fix what we don't understand. And as people of the U.S., as Christians especially, we need to stay in our lane. We have to do, or we can only speak about what we know, right? I can't critique a doctor or a surgeon whenever a patient dies under his knife because I don't understand the intricacies of the human body and of repairing it. And I don't think it's wise for people to critique police when they don't fully understand police work and the nature of it. And when you don't have a full understanding of how policing works, you don't have a full understanding of federal and local government laws. And like I said before, when you don't have the experience or the experience of fighting for your life or people trying to attack you and kill you, you can't fix what you don't understand. Just like, I can't fix racism if I've never seen it before, or I don't think it exists. Because unfortunately, I've heard people say that racism doesn't exist today. And that's just not true. But I think if we stayed in our lane and spoke about our personal experiences in a good conversation, and we spoke about things that we actually knew about, then I think we'd get a lot further. And that kind of goes with, I think we've got a problem of thinking emotionally about a lot of this, and it's hard not to. I mean, emotions have driven our I think the emotions have taken over our logical thinking, unfortunately, especially just maybe it's COVID-19 causing everybody to get amped up on top of everything else. I don't know, but we've stopped, thinking rationally in a lot of ways. And obviously racism is in our world today. And at times, like I said before, I'm sure it makes its way into law enforcement. But once again, in 7 years, I've never seen it. And so it's not as rampant, I don't think, as what some people are wanting it to be, or they think it actually is. But we've got to stop using our emotions to drive our brain and start looking at what is truth and what the end goal should be and how to accomplish that best for all parties involved. And that goes with education, right? We can't act on our emotions, because then we tend to not take the message isn't going to be received as well when it's extremely emotional, because it's thought of as, well, just that. They're thinking emotionally and not rationally, they're biased, whatever. But we need to sit down like we're having now and have a real conversation about, well, what is law enforcement? What is their goal? Why do they do what they do? And the same is vice versa. Why does the Black community feel this way? What is a viable solution to fixing this? And how can law enforcement help with that? Going back to people saying that there's not racism, and this is, I guess, a black mark on the church too. But we know, Megan and I know, a Black preacher who was not hired specifically because their congregation was white, and once again, that's a problem, and we can't let that work its way back into the church. And it, once again, the church should be leaders in this. But yeah, it's I think educating ourselves as a church, sitting down and listening and thinking logically is going to really help. Both sides, whether you're a cop, whether you're a Black male or female in the church. I think sitting down and listening to each other and talking to each other, and instead of just slandering somebody on social media or a police officer on social media, then maybe we should go to a police officer or a police department and talk to them. Well, why? I mean, what's your thoughts on this? Why do you think they did this? Or specifically, if something's happening in our towns, right? There's open records requests. I know all the police departments around here in the DFW area that I know of would be more than willing to sit down and talk to any citizen that has concerns about the way things are done, and if there's viable solutions, lay them on the table. I think most departments are willing to listen, to come and find the truth, to find what actually can fix this. And but you know what? It's interesting too, is that over the past few months, I've heard several times, well, the truth doesn't matter. Facts don't matter. And that was coming from Christians. And when we get that sort of mindset, there's a lot of problems with that. Because if we're to have an appropriate response for anything, we have to know facts. We have to know the truth. And so a lot of this rhetoric that's going around about all police are racist, they just want to suppress minorities, they're just here to do the government's will. I mean, a lot of that stuff is very wrong. It's not based in facts. I think it was the University of Michigan, or Maryland, the University of Maryland and Michigan State. They did a study, they titled it "The Truth Behind Racial Disparities in Police Shootings." And it's a very interesting study and very thorough, because they explain how they do the study, how it was unbiased, there's basically a study about the study showing its viability. But the data showed that each minority or each group of people, they were, they were, obviously the title's about police shootings. So they were shot and killed in accordance to the population. So this study said that if you live in a county with predominantly white criminals or white people, then the majority of your police shootings are going to involve white people. And vice versa is true. If your county is predominantly black, then the majority is going to be black. And that was one of the conclusions they came to. And they said in their study also that I think it was 95% of the subjects shot by police officers were actively attacking a police officer or a citizen. And 99% of those criminals also had a weapon. And so it's not what the media is portraying it to be. And these were based on, I think, 2018 stats. So the media is portraying it as, well, the police are just out here shooting innocent people all the time, when really that's not the case, based on the 2018 study. And, there was a deal in, I think it was Plano, just a few weeks ago, where I think there was a car crash of some sort, and one of the subjects involved in the car crash started stabbing the police officer as well as another citizen who was on scene. And the police officer had to shoot that suspect to stop the threat, And that person, that the police officer was getting, like, they were getting all sorts of flack from it online, like, well, you shouldn't have done that, who does he think he is? I mean, just all sorts of stuff that was coming out that just wasn't rational. And, if we're going to form an opinion against police, that's fine. If we're going to form an opinion for police, that's fine. But I think we've got to know the truth. We got to know our facts, right? And so it's misinformation is one of the worst things that's taking play in America and the church. It's pitting Christians against each other, and it should not be that way. And it's sad that it's happening. I would want Christians to know, people in general to know, that the price of freedom isn't free, right? If we want to have protection, then there are times in which force in which force is going to be necessary to keep them safe. And it doesn't ever look good. That's the nature of a fight. And that, it doesn't look good. More force has to be exercised over one person, at least for one side, to win. And I've lost fights in my police career, and they're not proud moments. But you know what? It doesn't matter. It just doesn't look good. And I would really, really, once again, strongly encourage anybody to, if they have questions about the way police do things, come and talk to me. I'm all ears. If you've got concerns, I'll listen. And once again, I think almost every police officer will. And if you want to know more what it's like to be a police officer, you can go through citizen police academies that almost every agency puts on. You can go to force on force training. And I think all those things would really help people see the police side of things, right? And so I guess in short, to answer your question, educate ourselves. We need to stay in our lane, and we need to listen. We need to be loving. We need to be wise. And all those things are really going to help bridge the gap.
Yeah.
I
love that.
One of the things that I'm really happy you asked me to do this was because I've had a lot of conversations with people who are struggling with their church congregations. That are, I've had conversations with police officers who are struggling with their congregations, far as how their congregation has handled the situation. And I know a lot of police officers are hesitant to even go back to church because these people that they called family, they're supporting, to defund the police, or they're supporting the rhetoric that all police are racist. And one guy I was talking to specifically said, well, they know me, they know what I do, and now this is what they're posting online. And so what are they going to be saying behind my back when I'm not there? And I thought that was pretty sad and he was a youth minister for a while at that congregation too. But a lot of officers are feeling that their church families, their safe space, has been taken away from them. And, I think that the church has failed in the racism aspect. And I don't want to see the church fail and lose good Christian men and women that are officers, because they're radically to the other side of things, So I think, hopefully this brings light to a lot of, people who don't have any sort of understanding to how police work, just as a lot of the conversations that you've been having with people on your post or your blog about, race, it's brought up a lot of good points and information that people didn't know before. So hopefully this does too. And I really want to encourage people just to stay in your lane. Know what you're talking about before you talk about it.
Yeah, that's so good, Nolan. I love everything you said. I mean, about staying in your lane, knowing, because I don't know what it's like to be a police officer unless somebody's been there on the street. They don't know. Just like I don't know what it's like to be an African American man. I don't know that, and the only way I can even begin to get a picture of what is it like being Black in America is to talk to somebody that's been Black in America. And the only way to know what it's like to be a police officer is to talk to a police officer. I still won't fully understand, and I won't be in a position to be an expert on the subject, but at least I can begin listening. And I think that what you said about listening, and I mean, love begins with listening, and we have to be empathetic towards each other's positions. And that's what and not just positions, but life circumstances, and to understand that one person has an experience and a burden that I can't even imagine, because of the color of their skin or because of their profession. That's what I think that, concerns me a lot, is the dismissiveness that sometimes happens, and it can happen on both sides of this conversation, where we say, no, you don't know what you're talking about because I have my experiences over here, or because I haven't experienced that. And so we just dismiss what someone else is saying, rather than saying both of those things can be true at the same time. Someone can have these experiences and someone else can have these experiences. And as a follower of Jesus, I want to love everybody, and I want to empathize with everybody and try to help bring people together. The church is all about reconciliation. And while, I understand what people are saying sometimes when they say they don't see color, I think it's really important that we say, no, I think it's appropriate sometimes to see color, not in a discriminatory way, but in a way that says a person of color has a different experience than I do, in the same way that I see your badge and I know Nolan has a different experience than I do because of his profession. And so we don't dismiss each other's differences. We love each other and empathize with the unique experiences that other people have. And that's what's supposed to be so special about the church. That's what the church is supposed to be. And unfortunately right now, if anybody feels like I'm not welcome there because of the color of my skin, or I'm not welcome there because of the job that I do, what a shame that would be, and how incredibly heartbreaking. So I really appreciate what you do, and I appreciate you having this conversation, brother.
Yeah, thank you once again for having me. And hopefully, once again, this brings some light to some questions people might have about police work or anything like that. And hopefully they'll come to me if they have any questions about it, as to why we do what we do. So I would love to find some reform that makes everybody happy, that we could all be unified and come back together. But we'll see. Time will tell. But it definitely starts with these conversations.
Yeah, Definitely. Well, you're always in my prayers, brother, and I appreciate you immensely. Thank you, brother.
Yes, sir. Thank you.